black and white.
Yeah.
And he said, I said, what'd you shoot? He said, 200 rolls. And I said, yeah, but somebody's paying for your film. And he said, yep.
Right. Right.
So that was the difference.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Where was this at?
That was in El Salvador.
El Salvador. What years are you talking about here?
83, 84.
Yeah, things were pretty heated down there at that time.
Yeah.
Were you actually working for somebody or for yourself, or what was that, freelancing? Or
I started out freelancing, and then I ended up working for a lot for the Australian wire service.
Just for registration purposes, here we are talking to Richard Flamer at the Catholic Worker Sugar Creek Retreat in 2011, September 18th, 2011. So go ahead.
I ended up shooting for as a stringer for Reuters and as a stringer for AP, and then I ended up working for the Catholic Church.
Oh wow!
In various places for Don Samuel Ruiz, the bishop in Chiapas.
I see.
I shot every year for 8 years in the refugee camps, the Guatemalan refugee camps.
Yeah, and there's tons of those there.
And 90,000 refugees.
Wow.
And then Don Samuel used my photos to raise funds in Europe.
And elaborate for the people who are not familiar with the historical situation from the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Central America. Those refugees were from Guatemala, and why were they there?
They were because of the 30-year Civil War. The particular camp that I worked in was a place called La Gloria, and it was 1,500 families that had actually deserted from the guerrillas. The guerrillas had a hard time in the beginning with their fighting with people who deserted, and so they set up this policy to kill the deserters, and they'd track them down and kill them.
Wow.
And this was the only large group to leave at one time.
Wow.
And it was so large because of 1,500 families.
Wow.
But they continued to have big problems with the guerrillas after the fact. But they were in a position where they had problems not only with the guerrillas, but with the Mexican military and the Guatemalan military.
Yeah. So it's basically everybody was against them, the right, the left, the center, and anybody else in between.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I spent, I basically spent 2 or 3 months every year for 8 years photographing them and their problems.
So this is how you started to put some seeds and eventually have pretty deep roots down in Chiapas.
Right.
Yeah.
And then additionally, during that time I was working with Bishop Flores and Archbishop Gerardi in Guatemala in the mass graves as a forensic photographer.
I see.
In some of the mass graves. And that was also sort of volunteer, and I would have to leave and go make money somewhere and then go back and do it again.
Yeah, and you're still doing somewhat of the same thing in a different way.
Right. And so now...
So explain what you're doing now for us. Where are you, let's elapse 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and...
We run, in the meantime, had been associated with the Catholic Worker at various times, usually through the anti-war work. And I came back to the States when my parents died. And I had a 2-year period where I was just in a deep funk. And I had
what year was that approximately?
92 and 93.
I see.
And I got depressed and
understandably so. I mean, you had a lot.
I had just left the mass graves.
Yeah.
Came up after my mother died and took care of my father, and then he died. And,
as some people would say, that's just some heavy stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I had known Frank Cordero for years, and Frank was still a priest at that time, and I got in touch with him, and the woman I was living with out there in California at the time, she and I adopted a little crack baby.
Yeah. Have a safe journey.
Thank you.
And so we adopted this little crack baby, Caitlin. And I got Frank Cordero to come out and baptize her.
All right.
And he baptized me at the same time.
Oh, right.
And so we ended up, and Frank said at the time, look, if you want to get away, come to the Catholic Worker. And he said, I'll be your spiritual advisor and bring your tools.
You'll find some peace there.
Right. And it actually turned out that way. I ended up going to the Catholic Worker and had a time about 5 years where I just sort of mellowed out and got over my grief.
You didn't return at all to Chiapas in those 5 years?
Well, by the second year, I was starting to get anxious. And so I went back to, I took Frank and Bob Wright, a union organizer.
All right.
And the three of us went back to Chiapas, and I got in touch with some of my friends, and we ended up helping to start a community center. Don Samuel had wanted a community center where the various Indian groups could meet in relative peace and sort of hash out their issues.
And again, remind us, what part of Chiapas was that?
This is in San Cristobal de las Casas, where there are 14 language groups.
Wow.
And there are many...
Just in that immediate area?
Right.
Not in the whole state of Chiapas?
Well, in the whole state.
In the whole state of Chiapas,
but they're sort of concentrated there.
Okay. And if you compare Chiapas to, say, Iowa or Minnesota or Illinois, what is it like, size-wise?
It's about the same physical size as Iowa.
I see. So it's a large state.
And it's 4.5 million people.
Wow.
So largely indigenous. And what we ended up doing was, what I ended up doing was visiting that.
So that would be like having 14 languages in the state of Iowa, which is a lot to really conceptualize.
Right. And then I came back and started working to raise funds for the community center. And then I would go down and spend 4 to 5 months working on the community center.
I see. Yeah.
And then going back to the Des Moines Worker and living there.
Okay, great. So let's just break it up here for a second.